I could feel each heartbeat pounding through my chest. It was a bright Friday morning, and I was sitting in the kitchen, anxiously waiting for my university entrance results. I had been up all night, with thoughts racing around my head like a pinball machine. What if I don't make it? What does that say about me? And who am I if I don't? Until it finally appeared. After a whole year and countless nights of studying, I was accepted into the degree I wanted to do. Notably, it was one of the most prestigious programs in the country, with only the top 2 percentiles being offered a spot, so naturally, I was ecstatic. And at that moment, something interesting started happening within me. I became hooked. I attached my identity to this degree, and it felt great. When people asked me what degree I did, it was always an impressive moment. So on it went. The sense of prestige and superiority consumed me. I spent hours a day and well into the night studying for exams that were still 2 months away, doing everything I could to maintain this image to myself and to others. It started with picking electives that sounded smart instead of what I was curious about, applying to companies I'd never researched because the name looks good on the CV, feeling crippling anxiety and jealousy every time one of my peers achieved something I didn't, and feeling accomplished only if other people knew about it. But in my mind, everything was perfect. Most people I met were impressed, and I kept telling myself that this was the life I had always dreamt about. Also, I thought, the world of prestige had changed my life in ways I couldn't fully see yet. But as I progressed further in my studies, I began noticing problems and behaviors that were too destructive to simply put aside. For most people chasing prestige, the question of why never really comes up. It seems rather self-evident. More money, more status, more autonomy, a chance to finally make your parents proud. For me personally, it was simpler and more embarrassing than any of that. I wanted people to think highly of me. I had an ego that needed constant feeding, and prestige was the most socially acceptable way to feed it. But that's just my version, and there are as many versions as there are people chasing it. Take money. For a lot of graduates, this isn't abstract. It's personal. Maybe you grew up watching your family struggle, and you made a quiet promise to yourself that you'd be the one to break that cycle. Maybe you just want the freedom that money grants you to do whatever, go wherever, with whoever, whenever, and however you want. That's a legitimate motive. But the problem isn't wanting money. It's assuming prestige is the most reliable path to it. But for most people I've spoken to, money isn't really the deepest layer. Dig a little further, and what you actually find is something more primal. The need to be seen. That feeling when someone asks what you do, and you get to say the name, and you watch their expression shift ever so slightly. That small, almost imperceptible moment of recalibration. That's what you're actually chasing, not the salary. That feeling. A psychologist named Leon Festinger spent his career studying this and landed on something uncomfortable. We don't evaluate ourselves in isolation. We look sideways, constantly, and we measure ourselves against everyone around us. What makes it worse is that there's a biological mechanism keeping you hooked. Every time you say the name of the firm, and every time someone's expression shifts, and every time the LinkedIn notification comes in, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical behind every other compulsive behavior. And you start to notice it, the subtle calculation before a social event, who's going to be there, and will there be a moment where it comes up? The almost involuntary way you find yourself steering the conversation towards it, not because you're arrogant, but because some part of you needs to hit. You want to be humble, you genuinely do, but humility and the hunger for recognition exist in the same person simultaneously, pulling in opposite directions. And most of the time, the hunger wins, quietly, plausibly, and dressed up as confidence. I want you to sit with that for a second, because that's not ambition, that's a chemical, and chemicals don't care about your future, they only care about the next hit. Which means the moment you receive the offer letter, the spike fades, and your brain is already scanning for the next thing to prove. The offer becomes a new baseline, the title becomes ordinary, and the name that once felt remarkable starts to feel like the minimum. You're not building satisfaction, you're building tolerance, and tolerance, by definition, always needs more. And the most seductive part of all of this is that it comes wrapped in the language of ambition. Nobody tells you they're chasing dopamine hits. They tell you they want freedom. the salary that means you never have to say no, and the seniority that lets you finally call the shots. It sounds rational, but the path to get there runs directly through the opposite of all of that. The prestigious graduate program that owns your schedule. The structured hierarchy where years pass before you're trusted with a single meaningful decision. You hand over your autonomy now on the promise you'll get it back later. Yet, most people never do. The handcuffs just get more comfortable. Which brings me to the last one, and the one that, at least for me, did the most damage. Because somewhere along the way, the achievement stops being something you did and starts being something you are. The degree, the firm, the program, they stop being credentials and become identity. For a while, it feels like confidence. It feels like finally knowing where you stand. But I found out what happens when that's threatened. The grades slipped, the applications didn't land, and what I found underneath wasn't resilience. It was nothing. I had built an identity so completely around the image that I had no idea who I was without it. That is the most dangerous version of this trap. Not the burnout, and not the wasted years, but it's losing the answer to a much simpler question. Who are you when there's nothing impressive left to say about yourself? Strip back any of these motives, and none of them are actually about prestige. They're about what's underneath: security, validation, freedom, proof. Prestige is simply the vehicle most people default to without ever asking whether it's actually going where they want to go, which raises the obvious question. Does it? So let's actually answer that. And to do it properly, I want to introduce a framework, not because I want this to feel like a lecture, but because it gives us an honest measuring stick. But before I explain it, I want you to think about something. Think about the last time you spent an entire day on work that felt completely yours. Work you chose, on your terms, that you actually cared about getting right. Now compare that to the last time you spent a day executing someone else's brief, being evaluated on someone else's criteria, in a system you didn't build and can't change. You don't need a study to tell you which one felt better, but there is a study, and it puts a name to exactly why. In 1985, two psychologists named Edward Deci and Richard Ryan published what became known as self-determination theory. 40 years of research later, it remains one of the most robust frameworks we have for understanding what actually makes work sustainable and satisfying. Their argument was straightforward. Human psychological well-being at work depends on three things. 1. Feeling like your actions come from your own volition, that you're there because you chose to be, not because you're trapped. 2. Feeling genuinely capable, like you're growing toward mastery at something that matters. And 3. Feeling connected to the people around you and to the purpose of what you're doing. Now I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like something a life coach says before trying to sell you a course. But bear with me. Because the question worth asking, the one the recruitment brochure never addresses, is whether prestige actually delivers any of these. And to answer it honestly, we have to start with what it does deliver, because dismissing it entirely would be dishonest. Take it from me, I felt it myself. The moment I got that offer, something shifted in how people treated me, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't feel good. The salary that comes with those jobs are real, and it's not just the number itself. It's what the name on your CV signals to every employer who sees it afterwards. It buys you credibility before you've even had the chance to earn it on merit alone. The people you end up working alongside are genuinely ambitious, and those relationships compound quietly over years in ways you don't fully appreciate until much later. These aren't small things, and if someone told you at 18 that one decision could accelerate your earnings, your network, and your future options simultaneously, you'd take it. Most people would. And honestly, I would have too. But here's what nobody wants to mention in the same breath. Because what happens after the offer is something the salary figure, the firm name, and the graduate ranking all conspire to leave out. Psychologists call it the hedonic treadmill, the well-documented tendency for humans to return to their baseline level of happiness regardless of what they achieve. And the most dramatic evidence for this doesn't come from careers at all. It comes from lottery winners, people who overnight receive more money than most will see in a lifetime. Studies tracking winners in the years after their win found that the majority returned to roughly the same level of happiness they reported before. Some fared considerably worse. The sudden wealth fractured relationships, removed the sense of purpose that ordinary life had quietly provided, and left people with everything they thought they wanted and no idea what to do next. If a life-altering sum of money can't move the happiness needle permanently, then what exactly are we expecting a job title to do? It works the same way with prestige. You land a job, you feel it, and then, faster you expect, it becomes a new normal. The name that once stopped people mid-sentence becomes just your job. The salary that felt extraordinary becomes a number your lifestyle quietly expands to consume. A study published in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization found that the happiness boost from a significant status increase fades almost entirely within 4 years. I want you to think about what 4 years actually means in your life right now. That's the entire duration of your degree. That's the time between being a first year and graduating. And according to research, by the time that clock runs out, the thing you spent years chasing has already become ordinary. And so you chase the next thing, the promotion, surely that will do it. Then the next firm, the better title, the higher floor, surely this one. Each time the spike arrives right on schedule, and each time it fades a little faster than the last. And before you know it, you've spent the best years of your working life on a treadmill, running at full speed, completely exhausted, having moved precisely nowhere. Now I know this is starting to sound like I'm telling you not to be ambitious. I'm not. Ambition is not the problem here. The problem is mistaking the vehicle for the destination. Because when you hold the average prestigious graduate role up against those 3 things Desi and Ryan identified, the picture gets uncomfortable. Take autonomy first, the very thing most graduates say they're chasing. And I know what you're thinking. You'll earn it back eventually. Put in the years, prove yourself, and the freedom comes later. That's the deal, right? Research consistently shows that high-prestige entry-level roles are among the lowest autonomy environments in professional life. You are managed tightly, evaluated constantly, and expected to perform within a system that existed long before you arrived. A survey of over 1,000 workers found that for 66% of respondents, job satisfaction mattered more than job prestige. And do note, this is not a small margin. Then there's competence. Prestigious roles often accelerate skill development, which sounds like a point in their favor. But accelerating in the wrong direction is its own trap. You can spend 3 years becoming exceptionally good at something you never wanted to do, in service of a credential that made sense at 22 and makes less sense every year after. And relatedness, the need to feel genuinely connected, is perhaps the most quietly devastating casualty. Not because the people aren't impressive, they are. But impressive and connected are different things. High competition cultures, rank-based cohorts, and the constant awareness that everyone around you is also being evaluated. So here's where we've landed. Prestige delivers things really early. But the research points in an almost entirely different direction when it comes to what actually sustains you. And here's the question I actually want you to walk away with. Not whether prestige is good or bad, but whether the version of success you're chasing right now, today, is actually yours, or whether you inherited it from somewhere and just never thought to check. Because there's a more useful way to think about all of this, and that's where we're going next. I want to tell you what it actually looked like when it fell apart for me. At some point during my degree, I had become almost entirely consumed by one question. Not what do I want to learn, not what kind of work do I actually find interesting. Just, how do I come off as better than the people around me? That was it. That was the whole operating system. Every decision, every application, every conversation ran through that filter first. And I had read enough self-help content to have a sophisticated vocabulary for it. I could talk about growth mindsets and compound interest and playing long-term games with long-term people. I could quote the right people, but I just couldn't apply any of it to myself. Because underneath all of it, the engine was still the same. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even ambition in any meaningful sense. It was ego, dressed up in the language of self-improvement, performing productivity, performing drive, but ultimately just feeding the same thing it had always been feeding. And then it broke. Not gradually, not in a way I could manage or spin into a lesson in real time. The grade slipped, not catastrophically, but enough that the story I'd been telling stopped holding. The applications I sent out came back with the now familiar language of careful consideration. And I remember lying awake at some point, genuinely unable to sleep, running the same loop in my head. What is the actual end goal here? Is having someone be slightly impressed for a few seconds actually worth all of this? Is that seriously what I've been building toward? That question, when I finally let it sit, was the most useful thing that had happened to me in years. Because I didn't have an answer, and the absence of an answer was the answer. I had been so completely oriented toward the external, toward what other people saw, what they thought, how I ranked in the comparison I had been running unconsciously since I was 18, that I had never once stopped to build a clear picture of what I actually wanted. Not what looked good, but what I wanted. And here's the thing, I'm still figuring it out. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I had the breakdown and emerged with a 5-step plan and a clarity of purpose that would make a LinkedIn post. The career path I want, the relationships I want to build, what I actually value when I strip away what I've been conditioned to value, I'm working through all of that. But I can tell you that I'm working through it from a lens that isn't completely distorted by the need to optimize for other people's approval. And that difference, small as it sounds, changes everything about how the question feels. Which brings me to the part of this that the research actually helps with. Because it turns out the question, what do I actually want from work, has been studied pretty rigorously. And the answers are less complicated than the self-help industry would have you believe. There's a study by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that tracked college graduates across every major field, from engineering to education to the arts. And what they found was striking. 91% of college graduates reported being satisfied with their lives. The percentage was almost identical across every single major, regardless of earnings. Education graduates had the lowest median salary, $46,000 a year, and consistently reported some of the highest levels of satisfaction with intellectual challenge and job security. Let me say that again, because it directly contradicts the thing most graduates are told. The people earning the least were not the least satisfied. The people who followed the most prestigious path were not the most fulfilled. Satisfaction tracks something else entirely. And that something else has been documented in a particularly uncomfortable way. In a study by John Atkinson and colleagues, researchers asked participants to choose between two job offers. One paid $40,000 a year, but everyone else at the company earned $30,000. The other paid $50,000, but everyone else earned $60,000. 70% of participants chose the lower absolute salary. They were willing to earn less money in real terms just to rank higher relative to the people around them. 70%. Think about what that actually means. Most people, when forced to choose, would rather be poorer as long as they're relatively better off than their peers. The comparison isn't a side effect of how we think about careers, it is the operating system. Now, I know what you might be thinking, that's an abstract study, that's not how real decisions get made. But I'd push back on that, because I just spent the last 15 minutes describing exactly how I made every major decision in my career, and it was precisely this logic running silently in the background the entire time. Less about what I genuinely wanted, and more about how I ranked. And I'll give you the most ironic version of this I can think of, which is this. YouTube. Making this video. It's not impressive. Nobody at the careers fair is going to get excited when you say you edit videos on the weekend. But I've spent more hours genuinely absorbed in learning how to tell a story, how to cut a sequence, how to structure an argument on screen, than I have in most of the coursework I chose, specifically because it looked good. Statistics and analytics, which I'd grown up thinking was my thing, and don't get me wrong, I still find it interesting. But this has been surprisingly, almost embarrassingly more engaging, and I didn't see that coming. So if social comparison is the wrong measuring stick, and the research is fairly clear that it is, then what's the right one? This is where self-determination theory actually becomes useful in a practical way, rather than just a framework for critiquing prestige. Because Deci and Ryan's 3 needs, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, aren't just a description of what makes work satisfying. They're a checklist you can actually use when evaluating a decision. Not, is this prestigious? Not, will people be impressed when I say the name? But, will this role give me genuine control over my work? Or will I spend years executing someone else's decisions? Will I be building skills I actually want, or getting fast at things I don't care about? Does the work feel like it matters, to me, not just on paper? These are harder questions than a prestige ranking. They don't produce a clean answer, but they produce a decision that's actually about you, rather than about the story you're telling the room. Because there's a difference between using prestige as a tool and organizing your entire identity around it. Between taking a prestigious role because it specifically advances something you've thought clearly about, and taking it because it's the most impressive option available, and you've never stopped to ask whether impressive is the point. And most people never stop to ask. They move through the options, pick the most impressive one, and then spend years wondering why it doesn't feel the way they thought it would. Not miserable exactly, but just off. Because the salary is real, and the title is real, and the LinkedIn bio looks exactly how they always want it to look. But somewhere underneath all of it, there's a low hum they just can't quite name. That's the thing about using prestige as your identity. It doesn't announce itself as a trap. It arrives dressed as a reward, slowly burning you out. But here's what the research actually shows. When 1.7 million employee surveys were analyzed across 1,500 companies, researchers were looking for what burned out employees said when asked what makes their workplace great. The top phrase wasn't learning opportunities, it wasn't meaningful work, but rather, it was the golden handcuffs. Burned out employees describing their workplace positively and landing on the phrase that literally means I am financially trapped here. That's not a coincidence, that's the prestige trap in its final form, where the salary, the title, and the lifestyle you've built around them have closed off the exit, and the only thing keeping you there is the cost of leaving. So here's a question I actually want you to walk away with. Not whether you should or shouldn't chase prestige, but whether, when you picture the life you're working toward, the actual day-to-day texture of it, not the CV version, whether prestige is genuinely in service of that, or whether it's been the whole point quietly without you ever deciding it should be. Because prestige is a useful signal, but it is a terrible compass, and the difference between the two is everything. I want to go back to that Friday morning one more time. The kitchen table, the refreshing, the heartbeat. That moment was real. I want to be clear about that. The feeling of having worked for something and actually getting it. That is not a small thing. And the years that followed, as painful and disorienting as parts of them were, gave me something I genuinely couldn't have gotten any other way. Because here's the part of this story I haven't told you yet. Chasing prestige put me in rooms with people who fundamentally changed who I am. People who are smarter than me, more disciplined than me, more clear-eyed about what they wanted than I was at the time. People who pushed me, challenged me, and without necessarily meaning to, showed me a version of myself I didn't know existed. That is not nothing. That is genuinely one of the most valuable things that had happened to me, and I don't think I would have met them any other way. So if you're watching this and you're considering the prestigious path, I'm not here to talk you out of it. The title of this video is that you probably shouldn't. Probably. Prestige, used deliberately, can be a legitimate platform. The problem was never the destination. It was the fact that I was running toward it completely blind. No clear sense of why, and no honest accounting of what I was sacrificing, and no version of myself that existed outside of it. Because here's what I wish someone had told me earlier. When you attach your identity to something external, a degree, a firm, a title, you don't just risk losing the thing. You risk losing yourself in the process of chasing it. I spent a significant portion of my early degree unable to sleep, not because I was working, but because I was lying awake running comparisons, calculating, measuring, wondering whether I was ahead or behind in a race that I had never consciously agreed to enter. That is not growth. That is just suffering with better branding. If you do go down the path of prestige, and many of you will, and many of you should, here's what I'd ask to carry with you. Why this one specifically? Not prestige in the abstract, this firm, this role, and this path. What does it give you that the next option down doesn't? And what does the exit look like in 3 years? Does following this path open options or quietly close them? And most honestly, is the version of success you're chasing actually yours? Or did you absorb it from somewhere and just never stop to ask whether it fits? This took a long time to make, and it took a certain amount of honesty I wasn't entirely comfortable with. If it landed in any way that felt useful, I'd ask one thing. Think of someone in your life who might be going through what I described. Someone running hard without knowing why. Share it with them, not as a lecture, but just as something that might be worth their time. And if it did, I'll see you in the next one.